It is time to check in with our CJAD 800 legal contributor. That is Chris Dimakos. And today, Chris, some new decisions, I guess, new amendments perhaps to tenant and landlord laws. Let's start with the ones in Quebec. So recent legal changes to Bill 31, they have passed. What does it mean? And because I heard people now suggesting it's going to make for a more balanced approach between landlord and tenant. How's that going to work?
Right. It's making news now because, our neighbors in Ontario just recently, we're talking about very, very, very recently, had new amendments where they pushed or let's say clawed back a lot of the tenant rights in favor of landlords, much to the dismay of tenant advocacy groups. And they're saying that this is going to make a whole bunch of people, if not become homeless, have a lot of trouble paying their rent. But that being said, the spotlight now has been refocused on Quebec and taking a look at what we've done recently. And we've taken a more balanced approach. But what has happened is the Quebec government has tried to end speculation, which means, for example, in the past, what someone would be able to do is go and rent 2 or 3 or 4 apartments, and they knew that there was tight supply, and they would sublet their leases to third parties for profit. So you would have non-owners of these buildings sign 4, 5, 6 residential leases, and then they would start subletting them out for a profit. So that's been prohibited with these new amendments. And at the same time, landlords, when they are faced with an assignment of a lease, so a tenant that says, hey, I'd like to give my lease to my friend, and unless you have serious reason to, they can take on that lease, and you have no chance of denying me that right. Well, now they do. So tenants can automatically refuse any assignment, which allows them to re-rent it to whoever they would like. So the tenant has been stripped of that right to be able to decide who they transfer their lease to. So it's a much more balanced approach where tenants really win in Quebec is that in the past, when someone would repossess your apartment, they would have to pay you 3 months of rent and some reasonable moving expenses. Well, now what they've done, which I find is really impactful for long-term tenants, they're talking about a month per year. So if you are a tenant who's been living in your apartment for 10 years and your landlord wants to repossess, well, they might be on the hook to pay you 10 months of rent plus moving expenses. So it's almost as if you have some equity in your residential lease with your apartment or your condo. So much different picture in Quebec than we have in Ontario, which is way more pro-landlord than it is tenant.
Okay, I'm kind of confused here in a couple of spots. So let's say you're this tenant, right? Your scenario is you live in a place for 10 years, the landlord decides to repossess. Under this new law in Quebec, you'd be getting a month back for every year that you were there. So that's positive for the tenant, right?
Right.
Okay.
Very positive for the tenant,
right.
and that's because the longer you stay at a place, the more security you have of being there. Landlords are going to be looking for other places to try and remove tenants that might have been there for shorter periods of time because it'll cost them less money to remove them.
Okay, which then of course begs the question: if tenants or landlords rather are going to do that, and given the housing supply being as tight as it is right now, that will just make it more difficult for tenants, right? Once they are forced to leave.
Right. And so that's you just touched on the key point there. The difference between Quebec and Ontario, their platform is we're looking to increase supply. That's the only way we can correct this situation. It's not through laws. It's through increasing the number of apartments that are available. And they've made it a lot more difficult for tenants, especially those that haven't paid rent, to advocate for themselves in front of the courts. They barred them from filing motions if they haven't paid 50% of their arrears. There's a lot of different mechanisms there that would allow a landlord to remove a tenant who's delinquent on their rent, and that also have builders say, well, now it's more fair for us. We're going to go ahead and build our rental units because before, we would get tied up with a whole bunch of red tape, and the tenant laws are very difficult to work. So Ontario's, they're claiming that their position, making it more balanced, is going to increase supply. Builders are going to start building again, and rents are going to drop because there's going to be not 5 or 6 applicants for every space. There's going to be, the landlords are going to be fighting to get tenants and the other way around. So that's what they're saying. Here in Quebec, a little bit different. We haven't taken that much of a different approach to try and increase supply. What we've done is basically tweaked it so that, long-term tenants are more secure. Short-term tenants might have a little less rights than they did when faced with,
Right.
let's say, a repossession with a landlord or subletting and stuff like that.
If I can get back to what you started with, this idea that let's say you want to transfer your lease to somebody else, you're that tenant, and you have someone else who pick up the lease. How much power does that landlord now have here to simply say no?
Absolute power without giving you any excuse. Before, the law was such that a landlord can only refuse an assignment if they had a serious, legitimate reason to. Now, they can just refuse with simple notice without providing any reason whatsoever. Mm-hmm. You're still off the hook as a tenant. You can still walk, but you cannot force the landlord to accept who you propose is going to take this lease on. So it doesn't really affect the tenant that's there. It more so affects prospective tenants that wanted to take this assignment on from a lease. So you're basically taking that power of discretion on who rents the place away from the tenant and giving it to the landlord.
Which kind of begs the question, I think anyway, that, the idea being, imagine you're that tenant, you want to assign that lease. It's a way to keep the amount that you were paying as rent in place, right? And I'm thinking that a landlord is saying, well, wait a sec, if I get rid of this tenant, then and I'm going to rent it out to someone else, I can increase the rate. Is that the basic play here?
That is the basic play. And also what landlords have been advocating for is saying, look, I own the property. At the very least, if you're going to leave, let me have a choice on because the burden of proving serious reason might not be enough. Even though I have my concerns about a certain tenant, it just gives them back more control over the space. But you're absolutely right that the especially someone who's been there for a long time who has a very competitive rate. That's probably going to go away. That there are laws that protect, increases that are substantial, but most tenants don't advocate on those grounds. So you're absolutely right. That's going to drive up rent a little bit. But again, there's give and take in Quebec. I would say it's way more balanced than the new outlook that Toronto has. That there's in Ontario. I mean, and I can tell you all those properties, those apartments that are bordering Quebec and Ontario, and I'm not a real estate speculator, but I can argue that if you live within 5 minutes of the Ontario border, or if you have a rental property there, you're going to get a lot of people who were going to rent on the Ontario side who might drive an extra 5 minutes and rent on the Quebec side because of the way the laws are set up.
Interesting, isn't how that has shifted over the years from the landlords all of a sudden in control to now the tenants have more control in Quebec? It does go back and forth.
It does go back and forth, and it always is in tune with what's going on other fronts. With our population increase here in Canada, there are provincial governments that are trying to make adjustments to it. And that's they want to increase supply, they want to build, but you can't build unless you have the builders on board. Yeah. So now Ontario is saying we need to do this to be able to build out and increase our supply, and if we don't, we're going to be stuck in this vicious circle.
We will leave it at that. Chris, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Aaron.
I'm Luke Wilson. Join me each week for Film Never Lies. Since retiring from the NFL, I've had a lot on my mind, and now I've got my own show. So if you're tired of lazy takes, if you want honest conversations, join us each week. Film Never Lies, available on all TSN platforms and the iHeartRadio app.